The Holy Gospel according to Luke, chapter 6, verses 27 to 38. Now we're about to read some very difficult sounding rules that Christ would have us follow, but they're not rules. This is a new way of being human. Christ is inviting us into a new way of being human, and the world could use that today. I call it the Christ consciousness, a way of doing life that's different. Jesus said, "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not even withhold your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those for whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Have you ever noticed how toddlers interpret everything literally? So if you say, "What's up?" they go, "Clouds?" There was a mom and her kid was about to get hit in the head by something swinging past them, and they said, "Duck!" And the kid went, "Quack, quack." But it's not just kids who tend to misinterpret what's being said. It's also adults. Our passage today on the resurrection and loving our enemies are both misunderstood. We hear one thing, but Jesus and the Bible may mean something else by those words. So the question today is, how does the resurrection of the dead, which we often misunderstand, relate to loving our enemies, which we often misunderstand? And then, why should we care? What does the resurrection have to do with loving our enemies? The resurrection of the dead is misunderstood to mean life in heaven forever. We hear this passage read at the 1 Corinthians 15. We hear it read at funerals. And when we hear the word resurrection, we think, heaven. That's what it means. Well, does it? When people die, where do they go? To heaven. But the biblical picture, folks, is that we go up when we die so that we may come back down. We think we go up and we never come back. We're done with this old place. No, that's not the biblical picture. That's not the biblical picture. We tend to think that's what it means, that we are up there forever and we never come back. Paul here describes a time when the dead are raised. Now, why would we need to be raised from the dead if we're already up there? Huh? Why would we need our bodies need to be raised if we're already up there? You see, Paul here is not describing the afterlife in our passage. Paul is describing the afterlife. There is a time when we come back to get new bodies. And then we come all the way back down and we rule with Christ on the earth. That is the afterlife. The resurrection of the dead is describing life as lived forever and ever here on the planet, where heaven and earth are one. The resurrection of the dead, folks, is not, heaven is not the place where we spend forever. And this false picture makes it hard to understand why we should love our enemies. The simple picture that many of us have is that the Bible is our ticket to heaven. And we're just trying to do enough good to let us in. Or maybe we understand that by faith we get in by the shirt tails of Jesus, right? He is good enough for us. But then we're left scratching our head, well, what does that have to do with this place? What does that have to do with life now? Why do I love, if that's where I'm going, why should I care about what goes on down here? Like the popular fundamentalist preacher who said, racism in America is real. It's true. It's going on. But that's none of our business. That's none of our business. Our job is to get people go up there. If that's your focus, then that should be your focus. Only that's not the Bible's focus. You see, heaven is a waiting room. Do you know that? And we're not really complete until we come back down here. You know we're embodied beings, so we're going to do a little experiment here. I want you to tell me how much you like me, or not like me, but you can't use any body. Go ahead. What? 9 point. Well, you just used your mouth. You can't use any part of your body. Go ahead. Can't use your eyebrows. Can't use your voice. Can't use your hands. You can't do it. Human beings are embodied spiritual beings. This is who God made us to be. I would hate to get to heaven and then see a beloved loved one and rush up to give them a hug, and there would be nothing to grab but air as we float up there on the clouds. I would hate to get up there and in the smell of heaven there would be this delicious smell of fresh chocolate chip cookies coming out of the oven and not have a mouth to eat it with. We are embodied beings. We were meant to be embodied beings forever. That's why Christ was raised from the dead, so that we might have new bodies free of the craziness also in our spirits that makes this, because the problems in this world, folks, are created by us. So not only do we need a new body, we need a new way of seeing the world, a new way of being in the world that doesn't involve killing our enemies. Because we've done that for thousands of years, and it's really made this a better place, hasn't it? Hasn't it made it a better place? Has our approach made this world any better? No, the insanity continues, because we just can't believe that the way of Christ makes any sense, when the opposite is actually true. His way is the only way that makes sense. That's why we need a new consciousness, a Christ consciousness. So watch this now. The afterlife for all of us does not truly begin until the Christ consciousness rules the world. Christ the King? I think it would be terrible to ask all those who suffered in this life, the ones who are dead, to have them to come back here to this crazy thing. I mean, life is good, but it's also painful on many fronts. To ask them to come back here as the world as it is, I wouldn't come back here, would you? In fact, if you ask most people if, would you like to live forever? The answer is no. You know why? Because they don't want to be here. One of the things I notice about older people, the older we get, when I listen into our conversations, what do we talk about a lot? Oh, my hip. This and oh, that, because as we get older, our bodies betray us. I don't want to come back to that. And then we look at the insanity on the evening news. I don't want to come back to that. And so the book of Revelation pictures this great battle between the Christ consciousness that was released into this world on the cross through the death of the resurrection. It's here, but it's like termites eating away at the superstructure of evil, and at someday evil itself, the crazy consciousness that we live by, will eventually collapse under its own weight, and what we're left with will be the consciousness of Christ, and then the dead will say, let's come back. This is the fuller biblical picture. And there's a better way to be a human being. The way we eat away at the superstructure of evil is the Christ consciousness. This is why God created churches, to represent the Christ consciousness to the world, so that the world will begin to say, hey, let's try it Jesus' way and see how that works. The afterlife, folks, does not begin until the Christ consciousness rules the world. So here's the good news. The power of the Christ consciousness is already at work within us. The promise of the Holy Spirit, given to us as our counselor in the things of God. But there are some things that undermine this consciousness. One, we have the wrong story. You see, heaven is not sufficient a motivation to love our enemies. Heaven is not a sufficient motivation to live out the Christ consciousness in our world. A Christian that I knew who threw garbage out when they were driving down the road. Litter, and they said, well, it's all going to be gone anyway. We're just going to go to heaven. Why should I care about the planet? Now, logically, he was correct. Logically, he was dead wrong. You got to have the right story. Today we're describing the right story. That becomes our motivation. Two, we think the teachings of Christ are just too hard. Love your enemies. Forgive. Don't judge. It's just too hard, Jesus. You ever notice how hard things are until you have sufficient motivation? Your taxes are due tomorrow. All of a sudden, you find the motivation. A car is crushing someone. The average person comes up and they have enough motivation to lift the car. It's not about the heart, it's about the motivation. If you have motivation, that's what it's about. Not about how hard it is. The motivation, see, does the heavy lifting. If you have a vision for the world as it could be, that becomes your motivation. Oh, and by the way, do you really want to see your loved ones come back sooner? Your dead ones come back sooner? Love your enemies. The sooner the Christ consciousness is realized, the sooner they come back. And there we are munching on chocolate chip cookies. In this place, on this ground. My dad was a quadriplegic for 40 years, broke his neck when he was in his early 20s, never used his legs. In fact, he couldn't give you a good hug because his arms, it affected his arms. I never got to run with my dad, never got to hug my dad, not really. He's up there in heaven now. And there's someday coming, folks, when I get to hug my dad for real and run a race with my dad for real, not in the floatiness of heaven, but in the concrete reality we live in. That's motivation. 3, it's too late for me. I'm too old. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You know, Jesus died with two thieves on each side of him. One of them had the old consciousness. He's mocking Jesus, hanging there. This is a bunch of nonsense, you know. Both have lived their lives at the edge of death, but the other one has this vision of Christ as the Messiah. He says, let me come into your kingdom. And he does. Now think of the example of that one man hanging there on the cross. Think of how he's touched all those lives who needed a second chance. And this man became their example. And they got their second chance. This man helped change history at the very last minute of his life. See, it's about what we do with the time we have left. And you don't know what that act of love, the consequence of that, how that will echo into eternity. It's not about how old we are. You see, the grace of Christ does, and here's the good news, the grace of Christ does the heavy lifting for us. Because we were the ones being crushed by a consciousness that does not come from Christ, that does not love its enemies. And Christ at the cross, at the cost of his own life, did the very, very hard thing so that he could lift the weight of all that craziness off of us. So that we are free then to lift the burdens of others, even our enemies, even those we struggle to forgive. You see, it's the grace of Christ. It's the experience of the grace of Christ, the power of the grace of Christ that gives me the motivation to live out the Christ consciousness.